All right, guys, it's time to do Chapter 6, Population and Community Ecology. First thing is understanding levels of complexity in nature. So this is a good figure: individual to population, to community, to ecosystem, to biosphere. Okay, so you just need to understand what each of those levels is saying. Then we get on to talking about kind of population ecology and how scientists measure population growth. And this is a really good figure here as well. It shows that kind of population size is a system where you've got inputs and outputs. And what's important to note is that if births and immigration with an I are greater than deaths and emigration, the E for exit, then the population is growing. But if the births and immigration are less than the deaths and emigration, then the population is declining. So that's showing that really populations are dynamic. Populations are characterized by kind of 5 different characteristics: population size, density, distribution, so how spread out they are, sex ratio, the ratio of males to females, and then age structure. So that would be how many, varying ages. So I just need to have a basic understanding of the 5 of these things. All right, so then getting into factors that influence population size, and you see there's 2 major types: density dependent factors and density independent factors. Density dependent factors are affected by population size or density. So these are things that if the population size is more crowded, then these factors are going to have more of an effect. Things like disease. So we know that, with disease, that when you're closer to somebody, when there's a lot of people close together, disease spreads very quickly. Competition, food supply, space, water supply, these are all density dependent factors. Things that, depending on how many are in the population in that particular area, will affect will affect their survival. So what we do see is that population growth increases when resources are abundant. But we do know that resources are limited and finite, so they're not going to last forever. And just a term you need to know is called limiting resource. A limiting resource is a resource that a population can't live without. So it literally kind of determines the size of the population. If the limiting resource decreases, so does the size of the population. If there's more of this limiting resource, then there's more in the population. So phosphorus is a good example. Okay, so then we look at density independent factors, and these are factors that have the same effect on any area, on any species, on any population, regardless of how big they are or how dense they are. Natural disasters, drought, fires, climate changes, these events don't care how many people are there. A drought coming through, a fire coming through is going to have the same effect no matter how big. So these are 2 important types of factors that affect population size. Then it's time to look at some growth models. So they've made several models to help understand how populations grow, and there are 2 different types of growth: exponential growth and logistic growth. Exponential growth is the J-shaped growth curve, and this happens when there's unlimited resources. So this would be the population growing exponentially with no limits of any kind. Intrinsic growth rate is the max potential for growth under ideal conditions. So you'd see this here, has a high intrinsic growth rate if all conditions are ideal. Some species have a low intrinsic growth rate, so they still grow not quite as quickly, the population. Logistic growth would be an S-shaped curve. And this is because there are limited resources. And you can see that the growth falls to 0 at carrying capacity. So let me turn over to, here's the actual figure for it. Figure 6.7, this is the logistic growth model. And you can see that it starts off as exponential growth, and then it starts to reach carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is that the max amount of space or resource, the max amount of population can survive. And so once it finally starts running out of something, the growth starts to slow, or it eventually falls to zero. That doesn't mean that everybody's dying, it just means that there's no more growth, that births equals deaths. So this is the S-shaped curve, and remember that carrying capacity is that point where it levels off, because that's as much as the environment can support, and that K is the letter that represents carrying capacity. So then there's kind of some other like instances of things that happen. One of them would be called overshoot. This is when a population exceeds its carrying capacity. So sometimes a population just bumps up over the carrying capacity. Maybe there's a lot of a resource there, and then they overshoot, and then that resource runs out. So then there's what's called a die-off or a dieback, and that's a crash. Then it just kind of continues from there. So really the impacts are from resource depletion. So overshoots maybe have an excess of resources, but then it causes resource depletion because there's so many, so then there's a big dieback or die-off. Predator-prey is a very, very typical relationship that we see, and this is when predation limits population growth. So something different to think about. Best example, snowshoe hares and the lynx, but there are a lot of examples. But what I want you to pay attention to is this figure here shows a really good graph of predator-prey relationships. The fact that predation is what determines the population size. So the predators, the lynx, their predation determines the size of their prey, which are the hare, the snowshoe hares. And so it very much has this kind of cyclical thing, whereas one goes up and then they both and then they go down and up, and so it's a pretty good example there. Okay, so then let's talk about reproductive strategies. So there are species have different ways of trying to deal with population growth and how they reproduce in order to continue their survival. So reproductive strategies, the two main ones are K-selected and R-selected species. So there's different types of species. Most species are somewhere in between. But we'll learn about K-selected, kind of the end of the spectrum, and then to the other end is R-selected species, and we'll learn about the difference between those. But the K-selected, the K stands for carrying capacity. This is because these are species that tend to go slowly up to their carrying capacity, versus R-selected species which have a very high intrinsic growth rate and can sometimes overshoot. So let's just talk about K-selected species first. So this table is really good. This gives you a list of the differences between them. So you've got K-selected and R-selected species, and you have lifespan. So K-selected species have a long lifespan, R-selected species have short. Like some of them are insects, only live for a day. Time to reproductive maturity, it takes a long time for K-selected species to mature, go through puberty, whatever, to be able to reproduce, but R-selected species are short. So you can see that there's differences between them, different strategies on how to have their species survive. K-selected species are more adversely affected by invasive species because they tend to be specialists, and most invasive species are selected, so they're kind of opposite of each other. Now, biotic potential is the max reproduction rate of a species in ideal conditions. So if everything is perfect, which we know never is the truth, but if everything was perfect, this would be the biotic potential of a species, the max reproduction rate. So kind of looking at these different things leads us to survivorship curves. This is showing the survival of different cohorts within a species, and a cohort would be a group of that species in the same age. There are three types of survivorship curves, type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 and 2 are typically K-selected species. Type 3 is typically R-selected species. So here is a good figure for figure 6.12. You guys will also be doing a lab on survivorship curves, but you can see type 1, they survive, for a long time. Type 2 is just kind of steady, and then type 3, they don't live very long, right? but there's a lot of them. So you don't need to know metapopulations. All right, then we're going to kind of switch over to interactions between species, and one of the big ones is competition. And competition is actually not a good thing. It's actually bad for both species. This occurs within or between species when there are limited resources. So they are competing for some kind of resource, whatever that might be: space, water, food, mates. But the good thing is that competition can be reduced by resource partitioning, which we'll talk about in just a second. But understanding the competitive exclusion principle. This says that two species competing for the same limiting resource cannot coexist. So if they are trying to compete for the exact same thing at the exact same time, they will both die, or one of them will die. So the answer to this in nature, which is very cool, is called resource partitioning. And this is when two species divide a resource to decrease competition. And a lot of this has been adaptations over time, natural selection. But there's three types of resource partitioning. There's temporal, which is time. So a good example for this would be the wolf is during the day and the coyote's at night, and they both have the same role, like they both have the same niche. But what they've figured out is that one can be in the day and one can be at night, so they're not competing against each other. Spatial is another type of resource partitioning, and that would be space. So you can see here that in this space we're just looking at like roots, and they take up the space that they have. Sometimes they have to share the space, just depending. You can see that this grass has very short roots, where this tar bush has long ones, so they can both get what they need. And then this third type is morphological. This would be like shape or size. So this is just an example of a ferret versus an ermine, and they look similar, but they have different sizes, so they eat different things. Another good example would be the beaks of the finches at the Galapagos Islands, that they have adapted to eat different things, different foods, so that they can all coexist. All right, continue to look at relationships. Symbiosis is close long-term interaction between two species in an ecosystem. And this will go for the next couple pages, but the three types that you need to know: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Now, parasitism is covered here. It's actually a type of predation, but this is where they talk about parasitism. And so for these three, you need to know definitions. So what is mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, and you need to know some good examples of each. So this talks about parasitism, keeps talking about it here. Then it talks about mutualism, where they both benefit, and then commensalism, where one benefits and the other one is unaffected. Continuing to talk about interactions between species, we've got keystone species. Keystone species are species whose activities have a significant role in determining community structure. You need to know some examples. You guys will be doing an activity looking at this, but this would be the type of species that if you remove them from an ecosystem, there will be drastic changes. And it's not always who you think. It's not always the predator at the top. Sometimes it's just depends. I wanted to add this because this is covered when we're talking about this particular learning target or whatever, is indicator species. Indicator species shows that some specific aspect of the ecosystem is present. So, it helps to look for health or different things. And so you can look at the presence or absence or abundance or scarcity or chemical composition to indicate different scenarios. All right, ecological succession is a predictable replacement of one group of species by another group of species over time. There are two types, primary and secondary. Primary succession occurs on surfaces with no soil, like rock or pavement. Pioneer species are the first ones to inhabit the area, and then ends up with a climax community, which depends on the climate and rainfall, so like for the biome. Secondary succession occurs after a disturbance where soil is already present, so it's much faster because the soil is already there. And secondary succession does affect total biomass, species richness, and net primary productivity over time as the different species replace. Also need to have just a basic understanding of aquatic succession. Here's a good figure here. So as far as species richness is influenced by several factors. The four factors are latitude, so as how close to the equator you are, time, habitat size, and distance. So just again, a basic understanding of those four factors. But then this leaves us with a final idea of island biogeography, which is the study of ecological relationships and distribution of organisms on islands. So species richness, on a large island, there is more species richness than on a small island. On an island that is close to the mainland, there is more species richness than if you were on an island far from the mainland. So this is island biogeography, is kind of just looking at the species richness. Now, most island species are specialists because of the limited resources. I mean, they're stuck on an island, and so they usually end up being specialists for that particular area. But their long-term survival of island species is in danger when and if invasive species are introduced, because we know that invasive species typically are selected generalists. And that is it.